Hi everyone, welcome to this video. So in this video, we are going to walk through an application created for Center for Disease Control. So basically, this application will store, retrieve the diseases, and also manages the relationship between the patient and the exposure to the diseases. So we have created a project um within the package of edu.disease.asn1. So this package contains disease.java, exposure.java and patient.java. Starting off the disease, we have declared a class with two fields as private. One is disease ID and then the name. So here disease ID should be very unique. So we are going with the UID, which is nothing but universal unique identifier. So since we are declared as private, so that the other classes cannot access these fields. So with this we are just making use of the encapsulation, which is one of the oops concept of Java. So to set and get the values of these values, we are using setters and getters. This is a getters for getting the disease ID, and this is a setters for setting the value to this disease ID. And we are also using a method called hashcode and equals. So to find whether the passed object is equivalent to this current object, we are using this equals method. And hash code is a method which will create a unique hash value. With that also we can able to compare both the object is same or not. So to make, since there is a contract called equals and hash code, so if a equals method is being override, it is definitely we need to override the hash code also. So in this case, we have overridden the equals method. To make the hash code method very unique, we are using disease ID as an hash code parameter. And this toString will print the values of that object. So what are all the fields we have declared above, it is being printed here. With this help of this, we can print all the fields which is declared with this object. So moving on to the next class, which is exposure class, which has date and time of type local date time. In the previous class we have seen disease ID as UID. Here we are using patient ID as UID and exposure type. Exposure type can be direct or indirect as per the technical document. So we are using a constructor to set these values to these fields, and also we are using getters and setters. And since it is a setters and getters method, we have the data control. So if the value is being passed, we can validate the values. Here we are doing the validations. So if it is direct exposure or indirect exposure, so I have stored this in a constant, which I have declared here in a separate class. So I have direct exposure, I have stored it D, and indirect exposure I have stored it I. So whenever we are dealing with hard coding values, we need to store it in a constant and we need to retrieve it. Since this application might be a sample one, so in case of real time we might get a project which is of n number of classes. So in that classes, if we declare hard coded, so it is very hard to change everywhere. If we declared here, we can easily change the values so that it will get reflected here. So based on that validations, we are just setting that value, or else we are throwing in exceptions. So I have created a custom exception. So this unknown exposure type exception is a class which we extended runtime exception. And it is since it is a runtime exception, I'm passing that message which is coming to this constructor, and I'm just passing to the super constructor, which is which will go to the runtime exceptions. The same hash code and equals method and toString applies here. Moving on to patient.java. So the patient class has 5 fields, which is patient ID, string first name last name, and then exposure as an exposure array. Here we are storing those values as an array. The same applies to disease IDs, it is of UUID array. So as per the document, the constructor has to be initializing these two arrays. So we are getting the values in the object creation itself. Using the constructor, we are just initializing the arrays. Once the array is initialized with the appropriate values, let's take maximum disease is 3 and maximum exposure is 2. We need to initialize this array as exposure as 2 and disease as 3. And then with this add disease id, with the disease id pass, we can add the disease to the disease array. And before adding it, we need to check whether the disease array is full or not. So with this method, we are checking whether the disease array is full or not. If it is written false, it is written full, we are throwing index out of bound exception, disease array is full, else we are adding to the disease id to the disease array. Same applies to the exposure also. We are checking whether the exposure array is full, or else we are just adding the exposure to the exposure array based on the condition null. Whether if it is null, we are adding it. Get patient, set patient is like getting that patient id, setting that patient id to that object. I hope you are aware of that hash code and equals and toString method. So moving on to the next package, which is edu.disease.asn2. Here we have declared a abstract class of disease, which has abstract method string array of get examples, the same disease id and name. So we have you use the private method, so we are just getting the using getters and setters for it. Since it is an abstract method, we can't create an object for this disease class. A class needs to override this a class needs to extend this disease, and it has to provide some implementation for this get examples. So we are having two disease subclasses, which is infectious disease classes and then the non-infectious one. Infectious disease class extends disease, which is overriding. So infectious diseases are influenza, tuberculosis, COVID-19 and malaria. We are providing as samples, and for non-infectious we are providing samples, diabetics, asthma, cancer. And there is a class called patient also here. So we have patient id, first name, last name, exposure and disease id, which is same as we went through before a few minutes before. So the same class has been declared here also. So moving on to the main part of this program, which is an interface disease control manager, which will be explored to other applications. So which has a methods. It's like a rule, like interface is like a rule. The class which implements this interface has to provide the implementation logic. So we have just provided the abstract of that method, what are all the types what are all the type which has, and what are all the parameters which is it contains. Like for add disease, it should contain name and infectious. The implementation will be provided by the class which implements this disease control manager. So we have just declared those things as per the technical document. And moving on to the disease control implementation class, which implements this disease control. So we are initializing this disease control implementation with disease max patients. So based on the value, we are initializing these two arrays, and then for add disease, we are getting name and is infectious. So first we need to check whether the array is full or not. If else, we'll need to throw an illegal state exceptions, and then we are going to create a new disease, a new object of type disease, so that we can store this name into that disease. So if it is infectious, we will get true or else false. Based on that, we need to create an object. Since this is an abstract class, we can create only object for with the subclasses. So new infectious disease is created if it is true. If it is false, non-infectious disease is created. So we are setting the name to that newly created object, the name which has been passed from the parameter, and also the UUID, disease ID, using UUID.randomUUID method. And then we are adding that new disease object to the disease array, this array. Likewise, we are just doing it, and then we are returning that disease array. So for get disease, we are looping through the disease array, and then we are checking with the based on the disease ID provided, we are equating it, and then we are returning that disease. Else we are returning a null value. For add patient, we are getting all the parameters, first name, last name, maximum disease and exposure. We are just creating a patient object with the maximum disease and exposure passed to this constructor, and then we are setting the first name and last name and the patient id as uid dot random uid, and then we are just passing that newly created patient object to that patient array which is declared in the above. Once it is done, we are also having the same like to find whether the patient array is full or not. We are just looping through it and we are just getting that boolean value. Based on that, we'll be processing it. So for get patient, we are looping that patient's array, and with the patient id we are equating it and we are returning that patient. If else, we are returning null. And then one more method which is add disease to patient. So based on the patient id and disease id, we are looping through the patient's array with the patient id. If patient id matches that in provided patient id matches to that patient array's patient id, we are returning that patient, and then we are looping the disease array and we are checking whether the provided disease id is present inside the disease array. If so, we are adding that disease id to that patient which we retrieve via here, or else we are throwing a illegal argument exception like this disease id is not associated with disease list, or else the patient is not associated with the patient list patient id. And the final method is add exposure to patient. Here we are getting the patient id and then the exposure. Same, we are looping through the patient's array. We are equating whether the patient id and the patient is present inside this array. If so, we are getting that, we are fetching that patient, and we are using that add exposure method. We are adding this exposure to this patient, or else we are throwing an illegal argument exceptions. So these are all about the classes which has been created for this application. And coming on to the test cases, uh, let me run the test cases. So for the package 1, to test exposure test and patient class, we have tested this. So the patient class has been tested 97%, the exposure is tested 93%. For package 2, so package 2, the disease control implementation is tested 85%, patient is 95%, and disease is 93%, infectious disease and non-infectious 100%. So this is a code coverage as much as I've tested it. So few more has been need to be tested in case of like disease control management. We have to achieve 95%, so just working on that. So that's all about this project. Thanks for being patient. Thank you all.